In the previous video, we talked about the human culture and how it develops. And this is again explaining how our legal system becomes formative in its nature because it is part of the human culture. There is an old Latin expression, contra bonus mores, meaning against good morals. When we refer to a culture as against good morals, that it means it is primitive, traditional, and again, it is contrary to the human development as understood in our world today. My substantive question is, who is there to tell you whether that particular behavior is against good morals? And which are those good morals? Whose morals are they? And who is there to tell you that that behavior is good, the other behavior is bad? It is a question that we can answer using the historical past by philosophers, anthropologists, sociologists who are from Europe or from the western part of the world that tried to understand Africa. That comes from Hegelian philosophy of phenomenology, the Hegelian dialectics, how human mind works in a philosophical manner to understand the truth. This is where Hegel gets into certain problems when he looks at other cultures or other humans as pre-logical and not philosophical in their thinking. This convinced many European colonial imperialists in the sense that Africans are still pre-logical and they don't think philosophically. They are not rational, they are not reasoning in a philosophical manner. And in that manner, they need colonizer to develop their thinking capacity and their reasoning capacity to fit within the understanding of Hegel of the synthesis. So there is the thesis, antithesis, and the final part of it, or the what I call the apex, should be the synthesis, and that is the philosophical thinker. Hegel were his followers and was supported by other group of thinkers. And these are social philosophers that emanated from France. Lévi-Brul, in his social philosophy of culture, looking at the metaphors, the way poems are structured to give a certain logical meaning, convinced him that there are people with primitive mentality and people with civilized mentality. Some people talk of civilized nations versus non-civilized nations or primitive nations. These are still titles or words that are used colloquially, but they are not fitting in well in the New World Order and the standards of human rights that construes that all are born free and equal in rights and dignity insofar as they belong to the human community. Who is there to tell other humans that they are pre-logical? Their thinking has not achieved the level of the philosophical thinking and philosophical reasoning. Immanuel Kant a German philosopher of the 18th century and the father of enlightenment, said it clearly. A person is an end in himself and not a means to an end, rejecting all manners and means of slavery. Human beings, in whatever socio-cultural condition, socio-economic condition, socio-political condition, are endowed with the mentality in equal level, and that explains the dignity. This is inherent in the human nature. This is what distinguishes human beings from other non-human beings. And this again dismisses the discourse of evolution, that some cultures are still evolving or developing into full swing human culture or civilized culture. This is very discriminatory indeed. It is a prejudice indeed. I want to talk about African customary law. The African customary law was alienated from its community origins by the colonial policy that established indirect rule. And in that case, the legal regimes founded in the traditional societies were to be co-opted within the understanding and the range of the imposed or the received European legal systems in most of the African independent states. By doing so, it was again to prove that there is one superior law or superior legal system, and there is inferior legal system, and in this case, the African customary law. Let me start by giving you an example of an Australian Aboriginal man that shot Aboriginal woman using an arrow after referring to him with names used for male genitals. A white judge acquitted the defendant, arguing that what is the standard or the measure, or which are the precepts or parameters used to judge this fellow, which is not members or his own group. And that means his own culture. How does his culture interpret and understand the metaphor, the use of the language, those words alleged to be offensive in his culture? If we use a foreign culture, as in this case, to deal with retributive justice, it would equally be very unfair, prejudiced, and again, not treating administration of justice that would include the party. In this case, we see law as culture in the sense that culture explains the metaphor, the cosmology, the epistemology of a person. That is where we find a gap between the formal state law and the informal African customary law, in the sense that there is no dialogue between the two levels. And in this case, we end up getting into serious problems with the administration of justice in such places like the Republic of Kenya. There's so many unfair convictions and also unfair acquittals. And this depends on the judicial procedures and also the way the court looks at the defendant. Is the defendant included in the judgment? Does his culture matter? Is his understanding of crime matter? Or we take it for granted that whatever has been articulated as the state law should be taken the way it is, and there's no argument. By doing so, we are doing injustice to the development of the African jurisprudence. How do we take into account the metaphors, the cosmology, how this individual, the defendant, understands his environment, his natural environment? How do we judge his behavior, his conduct, which in this case is considered a violation of the law, by looking at the way his culture looks at that provision that he has violated? It is a question of a number of issues that makes the law enforcement problematic, policy implementation is problematic, as well as the interpretation of law and its application in the modern system very problematic indeed, because already there is a cultural gap in the understanding. It is sad and unfortunate that some of us still believe in the words of Western anthropologists and as well as Hegelian philosophy that treated African cultures as primitive, regarding primitive to be inferior or developing and requires some support from the superior culture. This is the question I pose to you when it comes to the standards we use to judge which is the good moral and which is the bad moral. If we claim that we all belong to the humanity, we all possess, or we are all shareholders of the human nature and dignity. That includes our mental capacity, the use of conscience, the use of human consciousness and awareness, our subconscious, our memory, and the way we judge the good from the bad comes from the person himself. And Immanuel Kant is very clear on this. The imperatives known as moral imperatives that are mandatory are within our human conscience. That's the small judge that guides us into the action to take. Then there's volition. Volition is the will of power. And I know what is good and what is bad, and I can choose to pursue the good. And this is categorical imperative that Kant places in his moral philosophy. By looking at it from the Kantian perspective, we know that all human beings are born free and equal, and there's no way we can deviate or depart from this precept. Thank you for watching. Peter here, University of Nairobi School of Law, Kisumu campus. Thank you and bye-bye for now.